Hello again. Last week we started to talk about paragraphing, and we're going to continue that discussion this week with some more practice in the discussion board. Last week we talked about how a paragraph must have a clear topic sentence, it must have adequate, meaning enough, and relevant, meaning on topic, supporting details. And it must also have a closing sentence or some kind of transition from one paragraph to another. But the distinction between a strong paragraph and a weak paragraph is often determined by the strength or the quality of the supporting details that are included. So we have to ask ourselves, what makes strong supporting details? Well, strong supporting details can come in many forms, and the kinds of details that you select are in part determined by the rhetorical situation, that thing that we've been talking about in English 101 a lot. What I mean by that is that the purpose of your writing, the audience for your writing, and to a degree, the context and occasion are going to have an impact on the kinds of supporting details you decide to include in your paragraph. For instance, if you are writing narratively, you're probably going to include a lot of anecdote, story, and description as the details that make up your paragraph. You may also include some examples, but a narrative paragraph is primarily going to use story and description. If you're writing because you want to inform your audience or teach them something, then you're probably going to use a lot of examples to help to illustrate the thing that you are teaching them. You might also use some facts and some statistics to also illustrate the concept that you're trying to demonstrate. If you're trying to persuade an audience or convince them of something, you're probably going to use a lot of fact and statistic because you want to get that logos in there, but you're also going to use expert opinion and testimony because you want ethos or credibility. Lastly, you'll probably also use some anecdote because you want that pathos or the emotional appeal to be part of your supporting details as well. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different paragraphs. Now we're primarily focusing on narrative, since that is the kind of writing that you're going to be asked to do both in English 101 and in English 099 for START. So the paragraph that we have here comes from an essay called The Danger of a Single Story, and it's by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I'm going to go ahead and just read the paragraph to you and then talk about the kinds of supporting details that she's using here. I come from a conventional, middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor, my mother was an administrator, and so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help, who would often come from nearby rural villages. So, the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Feed. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Feed's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Feed's family. So this paragraph is an example of a narrative. The primary idea that the writer is trying to get across is a description of the writer's family as being a middle-class Nigerian family. There's our topic sentence. You can see it highlighted at the top of the paragraph. But the supporting details that help to illustrate that idea are a mix of examples and story or anecdote. The first example we get that helps to prove that the family comes from a middle-class background is that the father was a professor. The second example is that the mother was an administrator. And the third example is that they had domestic help or live-in cook, maid, driver, that kind of help. After we get those first three examples, the writer then gives us a short story. She tells us a little bit about the year that she turned 8 and the year that they got a new domestic house worker. And we get a little bit of dialogue that happens between the writer and her family that helps us to understand the contrast between the writer's family and the family of Feed. So, using those three examples, the professor, the administrator, the live in domestic help, and then using anecdote or narrative in order to establish a contrast between the family of the writer and the family of the houseboy, help to illustrate that topic sentence. I come from a conventional middle class Nigerian family. And so that is the narrative. Let's take a look at another example. This example comes from the essay Leave Your Name at the Border by Manuel Munez. The gate agent was Mexican. There's your topic sentence. The rest of the paragraph helps to describe the gate agent. The details are descriptive details, and then we end again with a short anecdote. So I'm going to read it again aloud to you and then point those out. The gate agent, it turned out, was Mexican. Well coiffed, in her 30s, she wore a foundation that was several shades lighter than the rest of her skin. It was the kind of makeup job I'd learned to silently identify at the mall when I'm with my mother, who will say nothing about it until we're back at the car. Then she'll point to the darkness of her own skin, wondering aloud why women try to camouflage who we are. All right, so this is a descriptive paragraph that is trying to describe or help us picture who the gate agent is. She is not just any Mexican American, but she is a particular kind of Mexican American. So we get the description that she is well coiffed or sort of well made up, put together, that she's in her 30s, that her foundation is several shades lighter than her skin. And then we get the narrative contrast. We go back in time when the writer is comparing the gate agent to the kind of women that he would see when he was shopping with his mother. And that narrative sets up a contrast between the mother figure, who we can understand was prouder of the dark skin, and the gate agent, who we understand was ashamed of her darker skin. So using the descriptive sentence, the first two descriptive sentences, as well as the anecdote or narrative towards the end, helps set up a contrast that allows us as readers to better understand just what kind of a Mexican American the gate agent was or is. This example is a little bit different. This is not a narrative paragraph. This paragraph comes from an essay called The Change Within by Naomi Klein. And in this paragraph, the writer is really using a lot of examples in order to illustrate the topic sentence. So I'm going to just go ahead and read that to you, and then we'll talk about them. One of the most disturbing ways that climate change is already playing out is through what ecologists call mismatch or mistiming. This is the process whereby warming causes animals to fall out of step with a critical food source, particularly at breeding times, when a failure to find enough food can lead to a rapid population loss. The migration patterns of many songbird species, for instance, have evolved over millennia, so the eggs hatch precisely when food sources, such as caterpillars, are at their most abundant, providing parents with ample nourishment for their hungry young. But because spring now often arrives early, the caterpillars are hatching earlier too, which means in some areas they are less plentiful when the chicks hatch, threatening a number of health and fertility impacts. Similarly, in West Greenland, caribou are arriving at their calving grounds only to find themselves out of sync with the forage plants they have relied on for thousands of years, now growing earlier thanks to rising temperatures. That is leaving female caribou with less energy for lactation, reproduction, and feeding their young. A mismatch has been linked to sharp decreases in calf births and survival rates. Right, so again, the highlighted green sentence gives us our topic sentence. The topic sentence is about global warming and mistiming. So global warming has caused animals to fall out of step with critical food sources. That's our topic sentence. The rest of the paragraph relies on just two examples. The first example is birds, songbirds that whose young would eat caterpillars, and now the food source of the caterpillars is not available when the chicks hatch. And secondly, the caribou, that there's not enough green forage plants for the mother caribou to eat, therefore they're not strong enough to give healthy births. So we see that this paragraph relies primarily on example in order to illustrate that topic sentence. Here's another example. This comes out of a short article published in The Verge. The Verge's online magazine. And the title of the article is Go Read This Damning Story About the Spread of COVID-19 in America's First Pandemic Hotspots. And it's by a guy named James Vincent. And in this paragraph, we're going to get a mix of different kinds of supporting details. So again, I'm going to read it to you. Around the world, nursing homes have been hit hard by the pandemic, which is no surprise considering that their residents are some of the most vulnerable in society. In the US alone, in mid-August, 177,129 nursing home residents have tested positive for COVID-19, and 45,958 have died from the disease. This means that nursing home residents account for more than a quarter of total pandemic deaths, writes journalist Katie Engelhardt. Well, in this paragraph, our topic sentence is that nursing homes have been hit hard by COVID. And the writer is using both fact and testimony or expert opinion in order to support that topic sentence. The first bit of fact comes here. We get first the fact that We get first the fact that almost 200,000 nursing home residents have tested positive, and over 45,000 have died. That's the example of a fact or statistic. And then the last sentence, or the last supporting detail, gives us the expert testimony or the expert opinion. So what we've looked at is 4 different paragraphs. 2 that were narrative, 2 that were more informative or almost argumentative, you could say, but more expository in nature. And I just want to remind you that when you are writing strong paragraphs, we want to make sure that we use a mix of kinds of supporting details. When you're writing narratively, you're going to rely primarily on example, anecdote, and description. When you're writing expository writing or to inform, you're going to use example, but also facts and statistics. And when you're writing persuasively or argumentatively, you're probably going to use a mix of all of these. So this week in your discussion board posts, you're going to be asked to write a descriptive or a narrative paragraph about a person who you admire. And this could be anybody. It could be someone you know personally. It could be a famous person. It could be somebody who's not alive anymore. But I want you to look at the examples from The Danger of a Single Story and look at the examples from Leave Your Name at the Border and sort of try to imitate the way in which these writers use supporting details in order to strengthen their paragraphs.